let's talk about web scraping. One of the things we can do with Python. What is web scraping? Well, web scraping simply means programmatically, using Python or any language, grabbing data from a website. So for example, I can grab data from Amazon, from Airbnb, from maybe a recipe website. Any website can be scraped. So essentially, when we talk about web scraping, we mean downloading a web page, grabbing the data from that web page, cleaning it up somehow so that it's useful for us, and then using that data. You see, this is how websites work. We have a browser that we use, like a Chrome, and we have a server. A server is simply a computer somewhere in the world that has 3 files that are needed to display a web page. We have an HTML file, which is the content of the website. You can think of that as text and images of a website. We have CSS, which gives us the colors and pretty styling that websites have. And then we have JavaScript, which allows us to have different behaviors in our website, like submitting forms or having drop-down menus. And all a browser does, like Chrome, is say, hey, if Andre visits this website, let's say FIFA.com, browser is going to know when I type in FIFA.com that says, hey, server, can you give me the FIFA.com HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files? And the server says, yep, no problem, here they are. And then the page gets displayed onto our browser. So these 3 files, well, the data in them is accessible to us, right? It gets displayed on a web page. So these files are now something that we can actually check out. For example, if we go to the FIFA.com website, you see over here that, well, we have a pretty page with a lot of information. That's great. And if I right-click here and do View Page Source, this is the HTML page of the FIFA website. As you can see, it's pretty long, but it has all the data that we see in this page. Now, the CSS and JavaScript files are linked to it, but the main data, that is the text, maybe the images, are all here. So, for example, we have latest news, we have top 10 goals from the Women's World Cup. Well, let's find out. Let's say top 10 goals from the Women's World Cup. You see, that's what we have. We have the text right here. And web scraping is simply this, grabbing this data and then removing all the parts that we don't care about and just keeping the parts that we care about. And web scraping works because this information is public. In order for a website to get displayed, it has to be public. Maybe you're still wondering why web scraping might be useful. Well, there are many, many cases for it. For example, I'll link to this resource where it talks about some of the big uses for web scraping. Why would we want to scrape a website? And you can see here there's many reasons. Maybe you want to get sale leads. That is, you want to collect all the emails that are on a web page, maybe a contact form. Maybe you have a yoga office software product. Maybe go to every single yoga studio's webpage and find the contact information, scrape that data so you don't have to manually do it. Maybe you want to find all the jobs and open positions on a website. And instead of manually clicking through different pages, you can scrape that data. And there's many, many use cases. In our project that we're going to build for this section, we're actually going to scrape Hacker News, a very popular website for many programmers, and we're going to turn this into something even more useful for us to read, analyze, and stay current with our industry. But we'll get to that in a bit. Let's take a break here and learn a little bit more about web scraping in the next video. Let me ask you this. If you were a website owner, would you want people to scrape your website? Would you want people to access your data? Maybe you're Airbnb and you worked really hard to list these products, different information on here. Is it fair that anybody can come and just grab this information and maybe make a copy of your website? Well, not really, right? I mean, it depends. Most of the time, you don't really want people scraping your websites. Although HTML and the data of a website is available to all of us, it's just how our internet works so that people can see different web pages. Most websites don't really want you scraping their data. Now, there's actually a way that websites tell you what you can and can't scrape. It's called robots.txt. We simply say at the end of a URL /robots.txt. If I click enter, look at that. Airbnb has a robots.txt. Robots.txt simply says, hey, if you're a robot, if you're a web scraper or a spider, this is what you're allowed and not allowed to do. Does it mean that they'll prevent us if we break the rules? No, they can't really prevent us. But this is a gray area where you want to be ethical here and only scrape the data that a website allows you. So if we look at robots.txt, you see here that Airbnb has created a text file that tells us what you can and can't scrape. For example, we look at the user agent here, which says the Googlebot. Airbnb is telling, hey, Googlebot, you're allowed to scrape this information, but we don't allow you to scrape account, alumni, calendar, and you see that there's a lot of things that's disallowed. What about Bing SearchBot? Well, Bing, you're allowed to do this, but you can't scrape any of this data. We have YandexBot. What else do we have? We have Baidu Spider. And then we also have User Agent Star. That means anybody else. Anybody else, you're allowed to scrape this, but none of this information. All right, let's go to another one. Let's go to udemy.com. Here we see that anybody, we don't want you to scrape or crawl through any of this information, but we do allow you to access this API 2.0 course landing components. All right, so that's too bad. It looks like Udemy doesn't really allow us to do anything other than this API 2.0 thing, which we'll come back to. What about Hacker News? We're going to build a project around Hacker News. So let's see if Hacker News allows us to scrape it. All right, so this list is a little bit smaller. We see that for all users, we're disallowed to use these endpoints. So it's saying as long as you don't use these ones, these URLs, we're good to go. That is, if we wanted to scrape just the homepage, which is right here, that's fine. If we're trying to, let's say, go to comments, that's fine too, because this one wasn't in robots.txt. Again, if you remember, if we go to robots.txt, that's fine. The only thing that they ask is that we have a crawl delay of 30. That is, if we're going to crawl their website, we should have a pause so that we don't constantly use programs to hit their website because, well, this is going to overload their servers and maybe slow down their website. So what did we just learn? We learned that there is ethical and unethical ways of scraping websites. Yes, you can scrape any website you want. And as a matter of fact, there's Chrome plugins. If you Google Chrome plugin web scraper, there's a ton of web scrapers that you can use that allow you to scrape websites without even writing a single line of code. It's a good thing to practice ethical programming. And that means checking a website's terms and condition before you scrape it, checking the robots.txt to see what you can and can't scrape. Because usually the data you scrape from a website should not be used for commercial purposes because you're using somebody else's hard work to, well, perhaps make money. And this is why when we went to Hacker News, it asked for a crawl delay of 30 seconds. Right? If you're requesting data from a website too aggressively with your program, that's essentially spamming because this may break Hacker News. Now, before we get into web scraping, I want to note one other thing, and that is this idea of an API. If you remember when we accessed Udemy's robots text, they did tell us that there is some allowed areas that we can scrape or endpoints that we can use. You see, some websites actually allow you to access data. For example, Udemy gives us an instructor API. That is, if you're an instructor on Udemy, you can actually use their API. You can see it right here so that you can get different data. Maybe you can get a course review list, maybe a course questions list. But if I go here and I enter this in my URL, I'll get an invalid missing token. That is because right now I'm not an instructor, or at least I haven't verified that I'm an instructor on Udemy. It's going to say, hey, this data is only for valid instructors. So I need to pass it a token to prove that I'm an instructor on Udemy. And a lot of websites give you what we call API, or Application Programming Interface, access in a form like this called JSON to, give you the data that you need. And some websites only allow you to do this if you're a valid user. For example, one of the most popular APIs is this GitHub API, where you can access different information from GitHub. But in order for us to use it, we have to, create a user account and validate so that we are who we say we are. But then there's also websites like the Star Wars API that gives us free access. That is, anybody can use it. We don't need to verify that we're a user. We don't have to give a token when making a request. Instead, we can just request data. So for example, if I do the Swappy API and type in people and I hit enter, look at that. I get all this data for free. So that this, I can create an app around the Star Wars, which is what Swappy stands for. It stands for the Star Wars API. And we can grab all this information that we want. We also have things like the JSON placeholder, which I really like to use when building simple projects where we can get different information, like photos. You can see here that this is an API that gives us information with different photos that we can use. Maybe we have different posts that we can use. And again, these are what we call in JSON format, which isn't HTML, but just a cleaned up version of data so people can use it. The easiest way to get data from a website is usually using an API. Sometimes websites allow us to just access it easily. Or they might have an API, but it's only restricted to certain users. Maybe you have to register with their service. Maybe you have to pay for their API. In that case, we have this. But then there's also web scraping, which is maybe a website doesn't give you access to an API. Maybe you want to just have that information. For example, Hacker News doesn't offer an API as far as I know. So instead, we might want to just scrape the HTML of the website and see what we can use. So how can we scrape a website using Python? Let's find out in the next video. Hey there, I want to add a quick note about what we just saw with Airbnb and how search websites like Bing, Baidu, and Google actually work. Now, you may have noticed that the user agent Googlebot is, what Google uses to index websites. What does that mean? Google, the way it works, remember, is a search engine. What it does is it tries to figure out all the websites on the web and index them. That is, create essentially a database of all these web pages so that when I Google soup recipes, Google gives me a website that has soup recipes. Now, how does it know what websites have soup recipes? It uses this Googlebot. And this is how Google got started. What they did was they had a crawler that is a program that crawled websites and read websites, kind of like we're about to do with web scraping, to understand what the website is about. If the website mentioned the word soup recipes or had different text related to soup recipes, well, Googlebot is going to say this website is about soup recipes. So when Andre searches soup recipes, I know that these websites are the ones that we want to show him. And this is what Google and Bing and Baidu all do. They have their own bots and they're constantly crawling websites to see what is the most relevant website to give to a user. So Airbnb here is saying, hey, Googlebot, when you come crawl my website, don't crawl any of these things because I don't want you to. But anything else that's not here, you can crawl. Now, if you actually look through here, this is not everything on Airbnb because Airbnb wants Google to crawl their website, right? If I search for vacation homes in Costa Rica, Airbnb is interested for Google to post an Airbnb link to the top of the search. So what they disallow here is mostly user-specific thing that Google shouldn't have access to, like maybe reservations or payments. But there's a lot of other endpoints that are actually allowed for Googlebot to search. For example, Googlebot is most likely allowed to look at all the houses available in Costa Rica and actually rank them so that when I type in Costa Rica house rental, well, Googlebot is going to say, hey, Airbnb has a link to Costa Rica houses. We'll give that to this user. So anything that's not in this list, well, we're allowed to use. One tricky thing is that we see this allow here. What this allow means, it says, hey, calendar here is actually a disallowed endpoint. However, we allow inside of the calendar this iCal folder. You can access that one only. But if it's not mentioned here, so if anything in here on this list is not mentioned, that is allowed. So for example, Airbnb./ that's allowed because that wasn't on the list. If I maybe click on experiences, this is allowed because this -s/s/experiences was not on the list. So a website either has a robots.txt file because maybe it doesn't want specific things scrolled, or if it doesn't have a robots.txt file or just leaves it empty, it means, hey, I don't care. Google, you can rank my website, you can crawl my website, that's good too. And that's why Airbnb had different information here. We had specifically for Googlebot, for Bingbot, for all these search engines, but also for everybody else, maybe programmers like us that want to scrape the website. There you go. We secretly learned how Google and other search engines work. Pretty cool, right? All right, let's get back to the topic at hand. Welcome back. In order to learn about web scraping, let's actually build a useful project that we can actually use and maybe even add to our portfolio. What I want to build is a nicer version of Hacker News. You see, every morning as a programmer, I wake up and I usually read Hacker News because it's a great way for myself to stay up to date with the industry and just learn about general programming news. They have some really, really nice articles here, and a lot of programmers use Hacker News as a way to stay up to date with the industry. This page has a ton of information. As a matter of fact, every time you refresh, it's a new topic, new thing. If I go to the new tab here, for example, you see that these stories, as I refresh, new stories get added constantly. So it's a very fast-paced website because a lot of people post news links here to get traction because there's so many readers here. Now, in order for me not to get overwhelmed, I usually only like reading or checking out the stories that have over 100 points. That is, they've been upvoted by users. So let's build a tool using web scraping that when I wake up in the morning, instead of having to scroll through and find out all the stories that have over 100 points, because those are the most popular ones, maybe the most important ones. Let's scrape this data and then remove all the stories that, well, have less than 100 points so that I can only focus on the important news articles. Sounds pretty exciting, right? That's a great use of Python to make our life easier. Now, after we're done with this project, there are many ways to apply this knowledge. For example, one of the things that Hacker News has is every month they have a Who's Hiring, where companies post job opportunities for programmers. So a good project might be to actually scrape this data of companies posting different job opportunities and maybe try and figure out what the trends are. What type of programmers are the most in demand? Hey, are Python programmers the most in demand? Maybe by scraping and finding how many times the word Python gets mentioned? Or maybe is Java or JavaScript programmers the most common? And maybe you can create a website that tracks the trends of different posts to see, well, what skill you should be learning to stay up to date and make sure that it's the most in-demand skill. Just an idea. But let's focus on this for now. In order for us to scrape this website, we want to use a tool called Beautiful Soup. And Beautiful Soup is what we can use in Python. It's a library that we can use in Python to scrape websites. They have a very old school website here, but it's a very useful tool that most web scraping projects use. So in the next video, we're going to get our hands dirty. We're going to learn about Beautiful Soup and start creating our web scraping project with Hacker News. Let's get started. All right, it's time to get started with our Hacker News project. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up our environment. In my case, for this project, I'm going to use Sublime Text, but again, use whatever text editor you want. I also have my terminal or command prompt here, and I've created a scrape.py file. Now, the very first thing we need to do in order to scrape using Python is, well, we need to download Beautiful Soup. This is what allows us to scrape websites. So all I'm going to do is say pip3, and I want to install Beautiful Soup 4. This is the latest version. I'll click enter, and there you go. Awesome. We have Beautiful Soup installed. The other thing that we need is the requests library. Now, we're going to use the requests library a lot in this course. If you don't have it on your computer already, again, we just use it using requests. It essentially allows us to grab HTML files like Hacker News. So what we're going to do is say pip3 install requests. So once we have that, what we're going to do, and I'm going to show you why we had to download both. First thing we're going to do is to actually import request or requests. And the other thing is the Beautiful Soup. Now, the way we use Beautiful Soup is we say from BS4, we want to import Beautiful Soup. I know it's kind of weird because we installed Beautiful Soup 4, but this is how we import it once we've installed it. So from BS4, import Beautiful Soup. Now, why do we need these two things? Well, Beautiful Soup actually allows us to use the HTML and grab different data. So it allows us to use that data that we've gathered to do whatever we want to it, to scrape it. But the requests module is actually what allows us to download initially that HTML. So let me show you what I mean. The first thing we're going to do is create a new response variable. And this response will be the requests and the URL that we want to grab the data from. So you can think of this as a web browser that we're using without the actual window. Because this is what Google Chrome is doing underneath the hood. It's trying to grab the information of that website from a server. So let's go back here and let's go to Hacker News again. We're going to copy this link And I'm going to paste it in here. There you go. Let's make this a little bit bigger, like that. And what we actually need to do here is to say .get. So we want to get the information here. So we're doing a get request to grab this page. So that now, if let's say print response, I save this and I run by saying python 3 scrape.py. All right, I get a response, a 200 response, but well, what does that mean? What we're essentially doing here is if I open up View, Developer, and do Developer Tools, I click on Network here. Let's make this a little bit bigger. There we go. And I refresh this page. I get a lot of information, but the main thing that we care about is this, the first document, news here. If I click over here, you see that this is what we get. We get an HTML with all the data, but we also saw here that the response was 200. That means everything's okay. The server responded with 200 and it gave us a document. This is what we just got. So in here, we can actually say response.text that we got. So let me run this again and look at that. We have our entire HTML file that displays the text in here. Because we don't care about styling, right? We don't really care about styling. Maybe we don't even care about images. All we care about is the text. And for our purposes, we care about the actual link as well as the votes that the story has. So we grab this data, and now what we can do is use Beautiful Soup to clean up this data. Right now, this is a lot of information. We don't really need this, do we? Or at least we want to remove all the information that we don't need, such as stories that have less than 100 points. For example, this one over here with 176 points, we definitely care about. So let's take a break and see how we can use Beautiful Soup next. Welcome back. So we just received all the data from Hacker News, at least on the page that we requested. And we saw here that we received all this HTML information, which is great. This is just a string that we received. What Beautiful Soup allows us to do is to do something called parse. That is, we can use Beautiful Soup to convert this from a string to an actual object that we can manipulate and use, using Python to modify this data to what we want. Let me show you what I mean. So we can now use Beautiful Soup. I'm going to remove the text here. And we can say Beautiful Soup. And then in here, I can give it the string that we want with all the data. That is response.text, like we saw, which is the one on the left here. And then we parse it. That is, we tell it, hey, this data needs to be modified into HTML that we can actually use. So the way we do that with Beautiful Soup is we simply say html.parser. And this tells Beautiful Soup that, hey, this is HTML and I want you to parse it. So convert it from a string to something that we can actually use. And this creates what we call a soup object. So I'm going to assign it to a soup variable, but I can call it whatever I want. Now, some of you might be asking what this really is. And the reason that we have to do this is that Beautiful Soup also parses another data called XML. And again, if we go to the documentation website, let's go to Beautiful Soup documentation, and let's just search for html.parser. You see over here that we can have different parsers, such as the HTML parser, which comes built in, but there's also the XML parser and other parsers that we can install. So again, anytime you have a question, always refer to the documentation and just Control F and you'll find any extra information you need. 99% of the time, you're just using the HTML parser as the default. But what does that mean? What did this just do for us? Well, let's have a look. If I print here the soup object that we just created, and let's go all the way down here. Let's clear this for now and run our Python code again, scrape.py. All right, we see here that we got the soup object. It's actually a little bit cleaner. It's no longer a string. You see here that it's in full HTML. We have the title, we have the head, we have the body tag. So we can actually manipulate this as if it's, well, a Python object. So for example, I can do soup.body to grab just the body. So if I save and I run the script again, there you go. We now just received the body. Let me clear this so we can see it. I'm going to run it again. You see that now we have just the body. I can even do something like .contents. And if I run this, let's clear this again. I get the entire content, but you see here in a list form. Awesome. Now, using this soup object, we can do some really neat things. For example, let's say I want to find, using the find all method, all the divs that we have in this soup object. So if I save, let's clear this and run our script. How cool is that? We get all the div objects in a list form that's contained on that page. What about all the links? Maybe we want to get all the A tags, which are the links of the site. Well, once again, let's clear this for now and run our script. And look at that. We have all the A tags. That is all the links on the page. And you can imagine there's different uses that we can do here. We can say title. If I run title here, we get the title tag of our soup object. If I do something like A here, which is the A tag, and I run the script again, I'll get the first A tag that comes up. Another one that we can do is something called find. So instead of find all, find finds the first thing. So again, if I do find A and I click run here, you see that I get the same thing. It finds the first item. Now, why is this useful? Because if we go to our Hacker News website, and what I want to do is, let's say, go to the first link here, right click it, and then do inspect. This gives us, this HTML DOM object that gives us all the information on the page, right? So looking at this, I know that for sure, I'm going to want this A tag that has the link and the title. But I'm also probably going to want the votes, right? So if I keep going down here to this part, you see here that right here is the score. And I'm probably going to be interested in how many points this is as well. For example, I can use the ID attribute here. So let's copy this score. I can even do something like find and give it an ID that equals this value. If I now, let's clear all and run the file, you see that I get that exact same tag with the ID of this score. So by allowing us to grab these different elements throughout the page, we can selectively pick what data we want. Let's take a break here and learn more in the next video. Now, one of the best ways, in my opinion, to actually use this soup object is to use the select method on it. And select allows us to grab a piece of data from the soup that we just downloaded and created using what we call a CSS selector. Now, this is a Python course, so we're not going to focus too much on CSS selectors. I will link to a resource so you can learn more about them. But a CSS selector allows us to access this data using, CSS selectors. So if I Google here CSS selectors, you see here that, it's a list of different ways to grab elements on an HTML page. We can use the class, the ID, the actual element. So let me show you how to do that. I can say, for example, select A. And what is this going to do? Well, if I run this script, it's going to select all the A tags. Okay, that's nothing new. We've seen that before. We can do that for div as well if we wanted to. But we can go beyond just an element and say we want to select, let's say, the class score. So this class score can be accessed by using the dot notation. So dot score is going to grab all the scores on the page. So watch this. If I clear this and run here, look at that. I grabbed all the span tags that have scores on them. So you see over here that this is just a list of all the spans because this span has a class of score. This span has a class of score. And we can do the same thing with IDs. So if we wanted to grab this ID, we simply say, instead of a dot, which stands for a class, we do pound and then the ID. So if I run this, we get this one span because this is the only one with this specific ID. Now, I'll link to a resource where you can learn about more CSS selectors. They become really, really powerful when you start selecting different complicated nested elements. Let me show you. Let's start to plan out what we want to do. Now, in here, I'm going to close this for now. I want to grab the link over here. So that is the title and the link of a story that has more than 100 points votes. And everything else that doesn't have 100 points, like this one, I just don't care about. So I'm just filtering it out. So what we want to do is, first of all, grab this link and grab this votes. So we also list out how many votes the story has. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to right click, click inspect. What we know is that we want to grab this link that has a class of story link. Okay, so just to double check, if I go to this one over here and inspect, you see that here, this one has a class of story link as well. So let's just grab all the elements that have class story link and see what happens. I'm going to say dot story link because dot means it's a class. And let's see what we get. I'm going to run the file. And all right, we get a ton of lists, but it looks like they're all A tags. So these are all links that we can use. It looks like this is a list, so we can probably grab it using the square bracket 0 to grab the first element. Let's see if this works. I'm going to clear here and run this again. All right, look at that. Visual Information Theory 2015. That's the first item in here. So it looks like story link grabs us the A tags, the links for each one of these items. Okay, what about votes? Let's grab the votes as well. I'm going to right click, say inspect. And what do we have here? We see that we have class of score. So let's just grab all the classes. So I'm going to say that this is going to be links. And that is, well, just instead of grabbing the first item, I'm going to grab all the links. And I'm also going to grab all the votes. And all the votes is going to be soup.select. And then grab, what was it again? It was the score class. So I'm going to say grab all the elements that have the score class. And just to make sure that this works, let's just say print votes and grab the first item. So I'm going to run this. And look at that. I have 180 points because the first story, let's refresh the page because this may have changed. Yeah, it looks like, see, this website is constantly changing. It now has 182 votes. So if I refresh here, there you go, 182 points. Awesome. So we now have grabbed the two pieces of information that we really care about, the links and the votes. And luckily, they're all in order because each link, the first link and the first vote is together. The second link and the second vote is together. So that's useful for us. Now, just as a side note, with Beautiful Soup, we can keep chaining these, right? For example, I can now say votes.get and get, for example, an attribute name. So for example, I can grab a score over here and say, hey, grab the score from here. So that if I do print here and I run this, well, votes is a list, so we actually have to grab the first element. So let's just grab the first element, run this again, and we get none because, well, this is the value. The attribute is ID. So if I do get ID, for example, and I run this, I now get the actual ID value. So with Beautiful Soup, we can keep chaining these. We can keep selecting. So I can say dot select here if I want, if we have even more information. But in our case, we have the information that we need. It's time for us to go to the next step, which is to try and combine these and make it more useful. So let's do that in the next video. Welcome back. We have our data, but it's still kind of dirty. I mean, we haven't really filtered. I only care about the stories with over 100 votes. And we also want a pretty way to display them. So let's work on that. I want to create a function, and we'll call it create custom Hacker News. And this create custom Hacker News is going to receive links and votes, which we have above over here. Now in here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new Hacker News list that is empty to start off with. And for now, all I want to do is return the Hacker News list. But within this list, I only want to add the text and none of the HTML. So for example, for the links, we only care about the title. So how can we do that? We want to loop through some things. What we're going to do is say for, and we'll use enumerate here. So we're going to have an index and then an item. And in here, we're going to enumerate. Remember, we've seen the enumerate before, which gives us an index as well. And we're going to enumerate the links. And I'll show you why we want to enumerate in a second. So in here, I want to grab the title of each link by simply doing this. We're going to say link of index, or let's change this to IDX. That's a little nicer. So we're going to grab the index of each link, and we can use something in Beautiful Soup called get text. And this is going to get the text inside of the tag. And just to get us started on this, I'm going to just simply say hackernews.append and add to the list the title. So let's see what happens when I call this. I'm going to say create custom Hacker News, and we're going to pass it the links and the votes. So let's save, run this. Oh, and it looks like I cannot spell enumerate here. So let's fix that. It should be enumerate with E. Let's try that again. All right, no errors, but we want to ideally print this. So let's just say print and see what we get. I'm going to run this. All right, look at that. We have all of the texts, the titles of our links. That's great. Okay, but these titles are useless without a link, right? And if you remember, a link in an HTML is defined with what we call an href. This href attribute is the link that we can click to go to the next page or to the page of this title. So we can also grab that and we can call it href. And this is going to equal links index. And this time around, we don't want to get the text. We want to get the attribute, right? So we can actually say .get and then grab the href. And just in case there are no hrefs or maybe the link is broken, we can give a default in the second parameter, and I'll just say none. So that now, this Hacker News append, if we just append, let's say this time the href, and I run this, look at that. We have all the links on the page. That's awesome. But how can we combine the title and href now? Well, this should be fairly simple, right? We can use a dictionary. So in our list, we can append a dictionary that has the title, which will be the title that we have here. And then also have the link that will be the href right over here. So here, now we'll have a dictionary with title and link. So if I save and run this again, look at that. We have a dictionary that has a link and also a title. Awesome. So we grab the information that we need. We grab the link and the text. None of the other stuff matters to us, but we still have the votes. So how can we do that? The votes, well, we can create a variable. Or instead of votes, just to distinguish it from this, let's just say points. And points is going to be, well, what are we going to do? We're going to grab the votes index. Remember, we're looping through this. And we're simply going to say get text. Now, let's see what we get initially when we do get text. So in here, I'm just going to print points and see what we get. And I'm going to remove the print from here just so we can focus on the points for now. So I'm going to save and run. All right, we get an error. We get all these points, but it looks like I get an error saying list index out of range. And this is a little gotcha that you're gonna have to sometimes debug when scraping websites. But essentially what happened here is there's a story, and this is a special one that actually doesn't have any votes, which is very rare on the front page of Hacker News. But this one over here doesn't have any votes. So essentially what it's saying is, I never grabbed the scores, the points of this. So we have technically more links than we have votes. So by the time we get to the last link here, well, the list of votes is one less. So it's going to say, hey, I'm trying to grab the votes at the very end, but there's no more votes. This list is shorter than the links list. So we can just do a quick check here to make sure that when we grab these things, that we only care about stories with votes. And luckily for us, this is why we want to check if a story is more than 100 points. The way we're going to do that, we're going to add an if statement right here. Now, before we add the if statement, we actually want to convert this into a number. So we can say, hey, if a story has more than 100 points, then we want to keep it and append it to our new Hacker News. So the first thing we want to do is to simply say that we want to convert this into an int, but we also want to replace the points here, the space points, into, well, nothing. So we can use the .replace method and simply say, hey, anytime you see space points, which is what we see over here, I want you to replace that with just an empty string. So this is going to return for us a string that is a number, and then convert it into an integer. So let's test it out. Let's close the bracket here, hit save, and run our script. And there you go. we have our numbers. That's great. But again, we still have this error. So what can we do here? So in order to fix this, we have to change our strategy. Instead of grabbing the points, we should grab what we call the subtext. And the subtext is, well, what comes underneath the title, because every single title has these subtext. And underneath it, we have the score. Now, in our case, the top one over here doesn't actually have the score. You see here that we have the subtext, but there is no score. So what we can do is do a little extra check. If we go back to our code, we can now change this a little bit so that instead of having the votes here, what we can do is grab the subtext. And this is going to be the subtext class that we're going to grab to make sure that all links are going to have the subtext. So let's select subtext. And in here, we're going to change our strategy to say that, hey, the votes that I want, or in our case, the vote, because we're looping through here, is going to equal the subtext at the place that we're looping through. And we're going to select the class of scores. So remember, if we scroll down, class of score is what we want. And that's going to be our vote. Now remember, there are some cases where the vote won't be there. So what we can do now is say, hey, if vote has no length, because remember, we're going to get an array. If this length is 0, that's going to evaluate to false. But if it's not 0, then I want you to do all of this. So now, our vote, instead of doing index here, we can just say vote, get text, and replace the points. But it's only going to run if the vote list exists. So let's test this out. I'm going to run. Oh, and we have to change our parameters from votes here to subtext. So let's do that. Let's say subtext, subtext. If I save and run this again, we get list object has no attribute get text because, again, we get an array here, so we have to grab the first element in the array. Remember, because we're grabbing the subtext. So if I run this again, all right, it looks like we finally have our points and no errors. That's awesome. So you see here, when you're web scraping, you're testing out your assumptions and maybe you make some mistakes, so you want to adjust and fix them based on what the website does. Now in here, the last thing I want to do is to actually add the vote into our Hacker News append here. So let's remove the print here. And I'm going to add the votes as the points that we get here. Let's make this a little smaller just so you can see. Perfect. So we have this Hacker News append. So let's test it out. Now, before I show you, I want to show you something when it comes to enumerate. Why did we use enumerate? Well, it's because in here, we have two lists, the links and the subtext. And we're only enumerating over the links list. And subtext, well, is not being enumerated. So what happens here is we need the index so that we can access this subtext within our loop. Because otherwise, well, if we didn't enumerate, there's no way to grab both links and subtext items. So for example, in here, my links can just be converted to item and item. But subtext will just have to use the index that we have here. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, let's print this and see what it looks like. I'm going to print, hit save, and let's run our script. Oh, and we have a little mistake here. We got to make sure that the curly brackets are outside. If I run this, all right, we see that we get our data. And let's just check. We have title about security issues on VLC, which has a vote of 307. Let's just check that on the page. If I scroll down, about the security issue on VLC, which has 307 votes. Awesome. So this seems to be working. Our script is working. Wonderful. Now, the last thing I want to add here is this whole printing is a little ugly. And ideally, we can print things nicely to the terminal. Well, we have a module, a built-in module that we can use in Python called PrettyPrint. And we can just import it like this, pprint. Now, check this out. If instead of print here, I do pprint.pprint, let's see if we notice a difference. All right, it's a little neater now. We have a little bit more spacing and, well, it's a lot cleaner than it was before. That's really nice. Now, the other thing is, as we mentioned, we only care about the votes that have over 100. So let's add another if statement here. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And within the points here, we'll just say if points are higher than 99, then we'll append to our updated Hacker News. Let's save, give this a go. All right, it looks like we only have stories that have over 100 points. So it's nice and clean, a lot smaller now. Awesome. Now, there's a few more things I want to add to this. Ideally, these votes are ranked. So we have the highest vote at the top and at the bottom, the lowest vote. This way, it's easier for me to decide what story I should read first. Let's explore that in the next video. Bye-bye. Welcome back. Let's add another layer to our app, which is to sort the list of our links from top to bottom. And we can do that fairly easily. Let's here, instead of returning Hacker News that we have here, we'll create a new function called sort stories by votes. And we'll give it the Hacker News list. And we'll create this function up here. We'll say define sort stories by votes. And this will receive the parameter Hacker News list. And we're going to do just a simple sort algorithm here. So we're going to use the sort function that we have. We're going to give it the Hacker News list, and let's see what happens. I'm going to run this. Oh, and I have to do sorted here. That's the method. Let's run this again. We get an error here. And if we read the error, it says type error. Not supported between instances of dict and dict. What does that mean? Well, we're trying to sort items in a list, but they're all dictionaries. So Python is saying, hey, well, I don't understand. How do you want me to sort it? Do you want me to sort it by title, by link, by votes? You got to tell me. And this is a common pattern with sorted that you'll just have to get used to. We're going to use a lambda function. Our second parameter is simply going to be the key that we want to sort by. And that key that we want to sort by is, well, votes, right? So all we're going to do is say lambda and say key. And this key that we're going to sort by is going to be votes. So that if I save this and run this again, look at that. I have everything sorted by votes, as you can see. Now, if this is overwhelming to you with the lambda, you can go visit the section of the course where we talk about lambdas here. But This is just a common pattern that you can remember with sorting. Whenever you're sorting dictionaries, we use keys, and we can give it this syntax with a lambda and pass it the key that you want to sort by. In our case, it's the votes. The last thing we want to do is we want to actually have the reverse order. So the top item in the list should be, or the first item in the list should have the highest number of votes. So we can simply do that with the third parameter by saying reverse equals true, just like that. Now if I save and run our code, we see that we have a list of all the top links with the very highest one of 309 votes right here. Very, very cool. Now, the exciting part is that you don't even have to visit Hacker News website anymore. You can be a complete programmer and do cool things like just read the titles here, and we can read about, Facebook's $5 billion penalty due to privacy reasons by just selecting this link. And let's say you're using Terminal, you can just say open selection as URL, and look at that. We can read the story directly like that. Very, very cool. So now you have a cleaned up, more efficient version of Hacker News that you can read every day, and all you need to do is just run this script in the morning and get your reading done. Now, there's many ways that you can expand this project. You can maybe display this on your own index.html file so that you can actually click on these links. You can do this with other websites. But my challenge and exercise to you is this. How can we expand this list so that it includes more than just the first page of Hacker News? That is, if we go back to Hacker News, so far we've only scraped these 30 links. But what if I click more here and I want to go to this second page and I want to scrape the first 2 pages of Hacker News? How would I go about doing this? In the next video, I'm going to give you the solution, but I challenge you to figure this out on your own and see how you might do it. If you get stuck, well, I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. Welcome back. This was probably an exercise that sounded a lot more complicated than it actually was. So hopefully most of you were able to solve it. If you didn't, by the time you watch this video, you're going to say to yourself, oh wow, that was so simple, I should have figured it out. So don't worry, we'll get there. Let's see how we can do that. Well, if we go to Hacker News, you might notice something when you click on More. When you click on More, you actually get a new URL here with, well, you see the query string, which is a question mark here that says P2. So if I do P equals 3 here, we go to page 3, we go to page 4, and so on and so forth. So all we actually need is just this link. And all we need to do is go all the way up to our code. Let's minimize this for now. And simply just duplicate what we've just done. We grab a second response, and this response will be request.get, and this link with page 2. From here, we simply grab this soup and recreate it as soup2, and it's going to be from the response2.txt. Again, what we'll do here is we'll duplicate this code, and again, if you notice that this could be more efficient, maybe we can extract this into a function. That's good, you're starting to notice these things. So here we're just going to do links2, subtext2, which we'll grab from our soup2 and, well, soup2. And we can now just combine these two things by simply calling, let's call it mega links, which will combine the links with the second links. So we're combining the 2 pages. And we'll do the same for mega subtext, which will be subtext plus subtext 2. And because we've written our code in nice functions, all we need to do now is replace our parameters, right? All we need to do at the bottom here is say mega links and mega subtext. If I save this, this should now work. Let's have a look. Oh, and classic me made a bit of a spelling error. If we go over here, it's not mega subtext, it's mega subtext. Let's run this again. You'll see here that it takes a little bit longer, again, because we're going to 2 pages. But look at that. We have our Hacker News using 2 pages. You can see that it's clearly longer, and we have a story here with 951 votes. I should definitely read that. How to access quality of garments. Sounds very important. And there you have it. You have now just covered the basics of scraping. As you can see, it's very specific to a website that you want to scrape. Remember, you want to check to make sure that A, you're able to scrape the websites by checking the terms and conditions of that website and robots.txt, and try to use the data in, well, not nefarious ways. Be nice, be ethical. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit about how to expand on this and what you might want to try if you want to get more and more involved with web scraping. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye. You have just learned the basics of web scraping. It's pretty exciting, isn't it? A lot of power at your hands, at your fingertips. But let's say you want to go further, learn more, maybe become a professional web scraper. I don't know, maybe that's what you want to do. What are some things that I would recommend? Well, get more familiar with Beautiful Soup. But keep in mind what I said at the beginning of this section. Ideally, you don't even have to web scrape. Ideally, you can use an API. Maybe the website that you want to get data from actually gives you an API. For example, if I go to Airbnb API, you can see that Airbnb has announced an official API. So we can actually perhaps read about what data Airbnb just gives us access to. And that should be your first stop. Maybe if you don't have that, then you'll look at Beautiful Soup. The next thing you might want to look at is this framework called Scrappy. Think of it as Beautiful Soup, but with a lot more features. A framework is essentially an entire kitchen, an entire tool belt that you can use to scrape websites. And you use things like Scrappy when you want to scrape massive websites, massive amounts of data. A framework versus a library is that a framework almost teaches a new language in itself. It gives you all the tools necessary to do everything that you want when it comes to scraping data. Beautiful Soup, on the other hand, is smaller. It's a library, so it gives you a few nifty tools to do small things like what we've done here. Scrappy, the framework, well, is an entire thing in itself. You can go through their documentation and tutorial. It takes a bit of time to get used to, but if you want to do this maybe full time, Scrappy is something that you should take a look at. Finally, what do you do with all this data? Eventually, you might want to do something. Maybe store it in a text file, in a CSV file, something that we've talked about and we'll talk about in the course. But as you collect more and more data, maybe using something like Scrappy, you might want to start looking into using what we call databases. And databases allow us to store massive amounts of data and save it somewhere so that we can access it whenever we want. And there's a ton of databases, something that is beyond the goal of this course. But you may have heard of things like MongoDB, Redis, MySQL, Postgres. These are all ways to store data, store massive amount of data and access it. So you might want to learn about how to use a framework like Scrappy and collect that data and store it somewhere on a database so that other people on your team can maybe access it. The possibilities are endless. But if there's one thing that you're going to take away from this is, please be nice, be ethical, and don't do anything illegal because, well, I don't want to get in trouble. And I'm sure you don't as well. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.